He pointed out that these Blackbird stories are entirely impossible to track to any primary source or verify.
And there's a deeply tragic reason for that, isn't there?
Yes. The supposed witnesses who theorists claim saw the Blackbird are the very plant workers and firefighters who died of acute radiation sickness in the agonizing weeks following the explosion in Moscow hospitals.
So it is a myth built entirely on the silence of dead men. You can't ask them if they saw a monster with red eyes because they are gone.
It makes you wonder about the psychology of the surviving community. Did they invent this physical monster because the real monster, the radiation, is completely invisible?
You can't see, smell, or taste gamma rays. So the mind invents a giant bird with red eyes to give the abstract fear a tangible physical shape.
That is exactly the psychological mechanism at play. Human beings are visual storytellers. We struggle to process invisible threats.
And that exact same mechanism extends perfectly into the next major supernatural theory, which attempts to explain not the cause of the disaster, but how the disaster was mitigated.
The alien cleanup theory.
The alien theory. This one is wildly popular in certain fringe conspiracy circles, and it revolves around a very specific eyewitness account.
Right, the story focuses on a man named Mikhail Varitsky.
He claimed that on the night of the explosion, while the reactor core was burning, exposing the sky to thousands of Roentgens, he looked up and saw a fiery ball of light, roughly the color of brass, hovering directly over the exposed glowing core.
He said it stayed there in a stationary hover for several minutes, projecting two distinct beams of light down into the radioactive inferno.
And this wasn't an isolated claim within the mythos. The same glowing orb was supposedly seen again years later.
Specifically on September 16, 1989, during a secondary, much smaller radiation leak at the facility.
So the UFO conspiracy theorists look at this and claim that extraterrestrials were actively intervening in human affairs. They argue that based on the amount of nuclear fuel in the reactor, the explosion and the subsequent fallout should have been much, much worse.
They claim it should have rendered all of Europe uninhabitable for millennia.
And the only reason it didn't, according to this theory, is because these highly advanced alien orbs hovered over the reactor and technologically absorbed the bulk of the radiation,
preventing a global apocalyptic catastrophe.
I have to ask you, and really ask the listener directly, do we invent aliens swooping down from the stars to save us? Because the alternative, that we are entirely alone on this rock, left to deal with our own apocalyptic, world-ending mistakes, is just too heavy a burden for our collective conscience to carry.
That is a profound philosophical question, and based on the sociology of disaster myths, I think the answer is unequivocally yes.
Humanity possesses a deep-seated desire for a savior figure. When our own technology turns against us, we want to believe that highly advanced, benevolent beings are watching over us, ready to put out the existential fires we start.
But there is a very dark, deeply offensive irony to this alien intervention theory. If we connect this myth to the documented historical record by crediting glowing orbs from outer space for saving Europe, these conspiracy theories actively and callously erase the reality of what actually happened.
They erase the very real flesh and blood human beings who threw their own fragile bodies into the radioactive fire and sacrificed their health and their lives to stop the fallout. Recordatorio de apoyar el trabajo de análisis.
When we talk about the erasure of those human beings, it is vital that we strip away the supernatural folklore and ground this narrative back into the harsh, unforgiving physical reality of what actually took place.
Because the true documented story of how Europe was saved does not involve advanced alien technology. It involves human sacrifice and grueling physical labor on a scale that is almost impossible to comprehend.
We have to talk about the liquidators. This is the collective term for the hundreds of thousands of military personnel, engineers, miners, and ordinary citizens who were drafted and brought into the zone to clean up the most toxic environment on the planet.
And one of the most terrifying, visceral jobs they had to undertake was clearing the roof of reactor number 3, which was immediately adjacent to the exploded reactor number 4.
Right. After the explosion, the roof was completely covered in highly radioactive graphite rubble, pieces of the reactor core itself that had been blown into the air.
The engineers knew they couldn't build a massive containment structure over the open hole until that debris was pushed back down into the gaping maw of the ruined reactor.
Initially, the Soviet authorities attempted to rely on high technology. They didn't want to send men up there. So they brought in remote-controlled rovers from the Soviet space program, machines originally designed to explore the surface of the moon.
When those weren't enough, they purchased highly advanced, specialized bulldozing robots from West Germany and Japan.
but they vastly underestimated the environment. The radiation levels on the roof were astronomically high. Some areas were emitting tens of thousands of Roentgens.
And gamma radiation at that intensity doesn't just harm organic tissue, it literally shreds the atomic structure of semiconductors.
The intense radiation scrambled and fried the electronic circuits of the machines. The state-of-the-art robots simply rolled onto the roof, seized up, and died.
So when the cutting-edge machines failed, the state machinery turned to its most abundant resource, human beings. They ordered 3,400 soldiers to go up onto that roof.
The military commanders chillingly refer to them as biorobots.
These were young men, many in their early 20s, and they didn't have high-tech radiation suits. They had to improvise their own protective gear.
We have accounts of them literally cutting up heavy sheets of lead, shaping them by hand, and tying them to their bodies like medieval armor with leather straps, covering their chests, their spines, and their groins, desperately hoping the lead would block the gamma rays.
And the strict mathematics of their incursions onto the roof highlight the horror of the situation. Their time on the roof could only last for a matter of seconds.
The radiation was so intense that standing on the roof for just 90 seconds would give a soldier a lifetime maximum allowable dose of radiation.
The commanders would sound a siren, the soldiers would run out of a stairwell, shovel 1 or 2 heavy scoops of radioactive graphite over the edge of the roof, and run back inside before the siren sounded again.
Many of them reported a distinct, heavy, metallic taste in their mouths and a feeling of pins and needles on their skin, the literal physical sensation of their cellular structure being bombarded by radiation.
It is horrifying to imagine. But clearing the roof wasn't even the most immediately dangerous task. There was an even bigger, more apocalyptic threat looming silently beneath the ruined reactor.
Which brings us to the men whom history and the press often call the Suicide Squad.
As the nuclear core was melting down, it mixed with the sand and boron that was being dropped on it from helicopters, turning into this bubbling, expanding radioactive magma called corium.
And this lava was slowly burning its way down through the thick concrete floor of the reactor building. Directly beneath that floor were large, flooded reservoir pools of water, used for the plant's emergency cooling systems.
The physics of this potential interaction were a nightmare scenario for the scientists on site.
If that 2,500-degree radioactive magma had melted completely through the concrete floor and dropped into those massive pools of standing water, the sudden, violent vaporization of the water would have triggered a catastrophic thermal steam explosion.
The state physicists at the time calculated that the resulting blast would have been equivalent to a 3 to 5 million ton TNT explosion.
Wait, a 5 megaton explosion? What would the actual physical impact of that have been?
Oh, it would have vaporized the entire nuclear complex. It would have destroyed the remaining 3 intact reactors on the site, instantly releasing their nuclear material into the atmosphere as well.
The resulting radioactive cloud would have been so massive and so dense that it would have rained lethal fallout over entire major metropolitan areas.
Cities like Minsk and Kiev would have been decimated, and vast swaths of Eastern and Central Europe would have been rendered completely uninhabitable for centuries.
To stop that from happening, someone had to drain the pools. Someone had to manually wade into that pitch-black, highly radioactive water directly under the melting reactor and physically turn the heavy rusted sluice gates to let the water out.
3 men volunteered for this seemingly impossible mission. Their names were Oleksiy Yanenko, Valeri Bespalov, and Boris Baranov.
They waded into the dark, contaminated water, wearing only standard diving suits and carrying flashlights that were failing due to the radiation.
They knew exactly what was above them. They knew they were walking directly beneath a melting nuclear core that was actively eating through the ceiling.
But they navigated the labyrinth of pipes, managed to find the valves, put their combined physical strength into opening them, and successfully drained the water, unequivocally saving millions of lives.
And at this juncture, it is deeply important to use our sources to correct a widespread, incredibly persistent myth.
Yes. For decades, a dramatic story circulated in Western media and conspiracy circles that these 3 men died agonizing deaths mere days after this mission, and that their bodies were so radioactive they had to be buried in sealed lead coffins.
That narrative is definitively false. While they certainly absorbed significant, dangerous doses of radiation during the dive, All three survived the immediate aftermath.
In fact, Alexei Yanonenko and Valeri Legasov survived for decades, living well into the 21st century and receiving national honors. And Boris Baranov lived a full life until he passed away from heart failure in 2005.
The myth of their immediate gruesome death, while adding a Hollywood level of tragedy to the story, actually undermines the complex medical reality of radiation exposure and robs them of their long-term survival story.
The human heroism in that zone just kept compounding, because even after the water was drained, the crisis wasn't over.
The scientists realized the magma was still burning downward. If it burned completely into the earth, it would hit the water table and permanently contaminate the groundwater,
which flowed directly into the Dnieper River, threatening the drinking water supply for millions of people across Ukraine.
So, to stop the downward melt, the state brought in 400 coal miners from the mining regions of Donbas and Tula. These miners were tasked with digging a massive 168-meter-long tunnel directly underneath the smoldering reactor so that a massive liquid nitrogen cooling system could be installed to freeze the ground.
You have to try to conceptualize the sheer physical torment of those conditions. They were digging a tunnel through sandy earth directly beneath an active, burning nuclear meltdown.
The ambient temperature inside the cramped tunnel was unbearable, consistently registering well over 50 degrees Celsius or 120 degrees Fahrenheit.
The space was tight, there was very little ventilation, and because the heat was so intense, the miners found it physically impossible to wear the heavy, restrictive protective gear they were issued.
Many of them stripped down and dug the tunnel completely shirtless, inhaling whatever radioactive dust and isotopes were circulating in the stagnant air with every breath they took.
They dug that entire 168-meter tunnel in roughly 1 month, working in relentless, grueling shifts around the clock.
So when you hear the fringe theories about aliens flying in to absorb the radiation with magic beams of light, it is genuinely insulting to the historical record.
These roughly 600,000 liquidators, the soldiers who cleared the roof, the divers in the dark water, the miners sweating under the earth, they're the ones who achieved the impossible.
Their flesh and blood heroism, their physical suffering is the ultimate, undeniable antidote to the supernatural myths.
It absolutely is.
Yeah.
However, the human mind's capacity for myth-making didn't stop at explaining how the disaster was caused or mitigated. It also invented deeply disturbing, pervasive myths to explain the biological and ecological aftermath of the fallout.
Which brings us into the realm of biological horror.
Yes, the mutants.
If you grew up in the 1990s or early 2000s, global pop culture essentially trained you to expect a very specific kind of biological reality following a nuclear disaster.
You look at popular video games like the STALKER series, or even mainstream cartoons like The Simpsons with the iconic three-eyed fish.
We were heavily conditioned by media to believe that the 30-kilometer exclusion zone was a wasteland crawling with giant, multi-eyed mutant monsters, massive two-headed wolves, and aggressively mutated, glowing flora.
The reality of the biological mutations within the zone is much more subtle, but from a purely scientific standpoint, it is vastly more fascinating than the science fiction tropes.
Extensive, peer-reviewed studies of the animal populations living within the exclusion zone do show clear, statistically significant biological impacts resulting from generational exposure to the lingering radiation.
Field biologists have documented bird populations with measurably smaller brain sizes compared to those outside the zone.
They have found a significantly higher incidence of cataracts in the eyes of local rodents, increased rates of internal tumors, and widespread complex issues with sterility and genetic damage among certain insect and small mammal populations.
But to be clear, despite the genetic damage, there are no three-eyed squirrels. There are no Godzilla-like creatures roaming the abandoned, overgrown streets of Pripyat.
No, nothing of the sort. But what is truly profound here is the great, unexpected ecological paradox of the exclusion zone.
Despite the lingering radiation in the soil, despite the documented tumors, the smaller brains, and the cataracts, the exclusion zone is actually transformed into one of the most thriving, robust wildlife havens in all of Europe.
Animal populations that were previously struggling in the region, such as gray wolves, Eurasian brown bears, Eurasian lynx, and endangered Przewalski's horses, have seen their numbers absolutely explode.
I want to make sure I grasp the logic of this. Are they thriving simply because there are no human beings around to hunt them, build roads, or pave over their natural habitats with concrete?
Exactly. It presents a rather sobering, perhaps uncomfortable environmental truth for us to digest. The total absence of human civilization, agriculture, and industrial activity is actually more beneficial to the broader ecosystem than the toxic, lingering radiation is harmful.
The human footprint, our cities, our farms, our roads, is vastly more destructive to wildlife populations than the aftermath of a nuclear meltdown.
That is a wild, incredibly humbling perspective shift. But while the myths about giant mutant animals are mostly harmless pop culture tropes, there was a biological myth surrounding the human survivors of the disaster that was incredibly malicious and destructive.
I'm talking about the deeply disturbing Chernobyl HIV conspiracy.
This is one of the darkest sociological phenomena to emerge in the wake of the disaster, and it was heavily documented by international observers, including political figures like former U.S. Congressman Glenn Browder, who visited the impacted regions to study the sociological fallout.
So as the initial 43,000 residents of Pripyat and later hundreds of thousands more from the surrounding agricultural villages were evacuated and relocated to new cities across Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia, a whispered, pervasive, and completely unscientific rumor began to spread among the general population.
People started saying that the evacuees and survivors were carrying a contagious, highly infectious radioactive sickness. They literally equated this imaginary condition to a virus, referring to it in whispers as Chernobyl HIV.
The implication was terrifying. They believed that if you physically touched a survivor, or breathed the same air in a room with them, or became romantically or physically involved with them, you would catch their radiation sickness.
We have to look at the historical context of the mid-1980s to truly understand the sheer cruelty and the rapid spread of this myth. The nuclear disaster occurred in 1986.
This coincided perfectly with the absolute height of the global panic, the deep public ignorance, and the intense fear surrounding the actual HIV/AIDS epidemic.
People globally were already terrified of invisible, deadly, misunderstood viruses. Merging that existing intense cultural terror with the complex, misunderstood science of nuclear radiation created a potent, highly destructive, and deeply isolating social stigma.
And the real-world impact of that stigma ruined lives. Observers like Glenn Browder noted how this baseless, unscientific gossip actively discouraged romance, marriage, and basic friendship with the survivors.
It completely isolated people who had already just suffered the trauma of losing their homes, their pets, and their entire communities overnight.
And the impact wasn't just on a personal level, it was macroeconomic. Businesses and agricultural firms were terrified to invest in or buy products from the broader, officially safe impacted regions of Ukraine and Belarus because of this completely fabricated, superstitious fear of a contagious radioactive plague.
It highlights a tragic, recurring truth about massive disasters. The psychological, sociological, and economic damage often spreads much farther and wider and lasts much longer than the physical damage itself.
To counter this damaging myth, we have to look closely at the actual, verified statistical truth regarding the health impacts.
Right, let's look at the hard data from the United Nations Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation. When you strip away the panic and the rumors, what actually happened to human health?
We know the tragic baseline. Around 30 plant workers and firefighters died almost immediately from the explosion and acute radiation syndrome. But what about the wider population of civilians?
According to the rigorous scientific data collected over decades, the most significant, undeniable, and tragic health impact on the wider civilian population was an epidemic of thyroid cancer.
Medical authorities documented roughly 6,000 cases of thyroid cancer in individuals who were children and adolescents at the time of the accident.
I want to break down the mechanics of that. Why did the radiation specifically target the thyroid glands of children? How does that work biologically?
It comes down to the specific isotopes released and human biology. When the reactor exploded, it released a massive invisible plume of radioactive iodine-131 into the atmosphere.
This heavy iodine settled onto the grass in the surrounding heavily agricultural regions of Ukraine and Belarus. Dairy cows grazed on that radioactive grass, and their bodies concentrated the radioactive iodine into their milk.
Because the Soviet government was actively suppressing information, they did not immediately warn the public or halt the distribution of local dairy products.
Consequently, children drank that highly contaminated milk. Now, the human body naturally absorbs iodine and concentrates it in the thyroid gland to produce hormones.
Children's thyroids are particularly active and growing, making them highly vulnerable. So the radioactive iodine settled directly into their thyroids, bombarding the tissue with localized radiation and leading to a massive spike in cancer rates over the following years.
That is absolutely heartbreaking because it was a logistical failure, not an inevitable outcome of the explosion. If the state had just prioritized truth over pride and told people to immediately stop drinking the local milk, thousands of kids would have been spared.
But beyond the undeniable tragedy of the thyroid cancers, the United Nations data reveals something that heavily contradicts the widespread apocalyptic panic. Right.
Yes, and this is where science diverges from the macro conspiracies. Despite widespread, persistent fears and claims in popular media of mass casualties reaching into the tens or hundreds of thousands, the rigorous long-term scientific data does not show widespread, statistically significant leaps in solid cancers, leukemia, or generic mutant congenital diseases across the general population that can be directly medically attributed to the radiation exposure.
The ultimate sobering finding of these massive studies is that the immense psychological trauma, the forced chaotic relocations, the destruction of community fabrics, the chronic stress, and the pervasive fear cause far more widespread, measurable disruption to life expectancy and public health than the physical radiation itself.
So the true monster lurking in the aftermath wasn't a contagious radiation virus, and it wasn't a mutated beast in the woods. The monster was the chronic stress, the displacement, and above all, the systemic lies.
And that brings us to the final, most profound piece of this puzzle. We've spent a lot of time dissecting the fictional conspiracies, the government missile plots, the Blackbird, the alien interventions, the mutated viruses.
But here's where it gets incredibly compelling, because underneath all of that elaborate fiction, underneath the desperate attempts to make sense of the chaos, there was a true conspiracy.
A very real, very lethal, and heavily documented conspiracy of silence, bureaucratic negligence, and absolute state pride.
And in the historical record, no single individual embodies the immense, crushing, tragic weight of this true conspiracy more than the chief scientific investigator of the disaster, a man named Valeri Legasov.
I want to trace Valeri Legasov's journey in detail, because it truly forms the emotional and moral core of this entire deep dive. Right after the explosion happens, the Soviet leadership realizes they are out of their depth.
They appoint Valeri Legasov, a prominent inorganic chemist, to the Emergency State Commission to manage the disaster. He flies into the exclusion zone in a military helicopter alongside a high-ranking government official, Boris Sherbina.
You have to imagine this scene. Valeri Legasov looks out the window of the helicopter down at the ruined building, and he doesn't see a contained, standard industrial fire, which is what the officials in Moscow were still hoping for.
He sees the glowing, 2,500-degree exposed core of a nuclear reactor burning openly in the atmosphere. He understands instantly the physics of what he is looking at. He realizes they are facing a literal world-ending scenario if it isn't stopped.
And it is Valeri Legasov who takes on the unimaginable burden of designing the immediate, desperate mitigation strategy. It is his complex chemical knowledge that leads to the idea of using the massive fleet of military helicopters to drop over 5,000 tons of sand, clay, lead, and neutron-absorbing boron directly into the gaping, burning mouth of the reactor.
The goal is to smother the fire and absorb the escaping neutrons. He doesn't manage this from a safe bunker in Moscow. He exposes himself to massive, eventually lethal doses of radiation while organizing this frantic effort on the ground day after day.
He spends agonizing months trying to literally save the European continent from becoming a wasteland. And then, in August 1986, comes what will become the defining, fatal moment of his life.
The International Atomic Energy Agency is holding a massive, unprecedented conference in Vienna. The entire global scientific community and the world's press are demanding answers about how a superpower allowed a nuclear reactor to explode.
The Soviet state, needing to project authority and control, chooses Valeri Legasov to go to Vienna and present the official, comprehensive state report on what happened.
The state's expectation for Valeri Legasov was very clear, deeply cynical, and strictly enforced. He was supposed to go to Vienna, present a highly sanitized, carefully edited version of the truth, and place the entirety of the blame squarely and exclusively on the shoulders of the low-level plant operators, men like Anatoly Dyatlov, Leonid Toptunov, and Alexander Akimov.
The state desperately wanted the international narrative to be that Soviet nuclear engineering and technology are flawless, superior designs, but that these specific, foolish men criminally broke the rules and caused a localized accident.
And the incredible tension of that moment in Vienna is palpable. At first, during his exhaustive marathon speech, which lasted for hours, Valeri Legasov does exactly what the state demands.
He lays out the operator errors, the pull rods, the disabled safety systems in excruciating, meticulous detail.
But then, standing in front of the world, he takes a massive, incredibly dangerous, life-altering risk. He goes completely off the state-approved script, he boldly goes further than anyone expected, and he exposes the fatal, fundamental, systemic flaws of the RBMK reactors to the entire international scientific community.
It was a moment of profound scientific integrity and immense personal danger. He detailed to the silent room the absolute lack of a reinforced containment building.
But most damningly, he explicitly explained the disastrous, fatal design of the control rods with the cheap reactivity-accelerating graphite tips. He essentially told the world that while the operators made terrible, catastrophic mistakes, the reactor itself was a literal ticking time bomb, legally signed off by the state, just waiting for someone, somewhere, to press the wrong button under the wrong conditions.
He heavily implied that the Soviet state machinery, by deliberately prioritizing cheap, hurried construction over basic safety, was fundamentally at fault for the poisoned continent.
For the international community listening to him, this level of transparency and honesty from a Soviet official is breathtaking. They give him a standing ovation. They applaud his bravery and his science. The international press names him one of the top 10 scientists in the world.
But back home in Moscow, the state's revenge for his honesty is absolute, calculated, and utterly ruthless.
In a rigid totalitarian system, publicly exposing the systemic flaws of the state's technology is not viewed as scientific transparency, it is viewed as treason.
For daring to tell just half the truth in Vienna, Valeri Legasov is professionally, socially, and politically annihilated. When the state later hands out awards, bestowing the prestigious Hero of Socialist Labor title to those who managed the crisis, his name is deliberately, pointedly crossed off the list by the highest authorities.
They don't just ignore him, they actively, methodically destroy his standing in the scientific community. He is humiliatingly voted off the academic council of his own scientific institute by a margin of 129 to 100.
The KGB begins a vicious, pervasive whisper campaign, spreading rumors and smearing him as a delusional, unreliable alcoholic to ensure that no one in the domestic scientific community ever takes his warnings about the remaining RBMK reactors seriously again.
He is effectively exiled within his own country, locked in a prison of his own ruined reputation, while his physical body is slowly, agonizingly failing from the massive amounts of radiation he absorbed while trying to save that very country.
Which leads us inexorably to the final haunting chapter of his life. The date is April 27, 1988. It is exactly 2 years and 1 day after the explosion of reactor number 4.
Valeri Legasov is sitting alone in his study. He knows he does not have much time left, both because of his rapidly deteriorating health from radiation sickness and the constant suffocating shadow of the KGB surveillance. So, in an act of final defiance, he presses record on a simple cassette tape deck.
He sits there and records his final, unfiltered, completely unedited confessions. And on these audio tapes, he reveals the most chilling, damning secret of all.
He confesses that the high Soviet state apparatus, including the absolute top scientific authorities like Anatoly Pavlovich Alexandrov, the powerful president of the Academy of Sciences, knew all about the fatal explosive flaws of the RBMK reactors as early as 1984.
2 full years before the disaster ever happened. The documents prove they knew about the graphite tips causing reactivity spikes. They knew about the extreme instability at low power levels. Valeri Legasov had personally reviewed the data and warned them.
But men like Anatoly Pavlovich Alexandrov were too deeply entrenched in the political system, too terrified to challenge the immense, unforgiving authority of the Soviet state machinery to demand the massively expensive retrofits that would require admitting the initial design was flawed.
Admitting a flaw meant admitting failure, which meant losing their positions of power. So they chose silence. They did nothing.
Valeri Legasov takes these explosive cassette tapes, carefully packages them, and manages to get them to a trusted friend, a bold journalist named Vladimir Gubarev who worked at a national magazine. And then, having finally spoken the complete, unvarnished truth, Valeri Legasov takes his own life in his home.
The impact of his final act was seismic. His tapes were eventually circulated and published in the shifting political climate of late 1980s, blowing the lid completely off the state's elaborate cover-up.
The sheer, undeniable scientific truth of his recordings forced the state's hand, leading to the eventual mandatory retrofitting of all the remaining RBMK reactors across the Soviet Union, removing the graphite tips and adding safety measures, undeniably preventing another identical catastrophe from occurring.
There is such a deep, resonant, tragic poetry to this entire story. We have spent this deep dive talking about the wildest, most imaginative conspiracy theories, alien orbs, giant red-eyed birds, secret government missile plots.
People desperately invented these elaborate sci-fi plots because the human mind struggles to accept senseless tragedy. They wanted to try to make sense of the chaos.
But the actual documented truth, the truth quietly recorded on Valeri Legasov's cassette tapes in a lonely, quiet room, is far more chilling than any hypothetical alien invasion.
It is the story of a powerful bureaucracy that willingly sacrificed its own people, poisoned its own land, and lied to the entire world, all to avoid the political embarrassment of admitting a simple engineering flaw.
It serves as the ultimate historical testament to the extreme danger of any system, whether it is a government, a corporation, or an institution, where the truth is made permanently subordinate to the preservation of power.
And as we conclude our analysis of the past, it leaves us with a final, highly provocative thought to mull over as we look toward the deep future. In 2016, an incredible, unprecedented engineering marvel was completed at the site.
A massive new containment structure, a giant, sophisticated steel arch, heavily funded by the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, was slowly, meticulously slid over the crumbling, radioactive ruins of the original reactor building. It is an astonishing feat of international cooperation and engineering prowess.
But there is a massive catch to that achievement.
A very significant one. That massive, gleaming steel arch is structurally designed to last for 100 years. But as we discussed at the very beginning of this conversation, the land underneath it, the thousands of tons of radioactive magma permanently trapped inside the basement of the ruins, will remain highly toxic and lethal to biological life for 20,000 years.
So if you do the math, 100 years from now, that arch will degrade and need to be completely replaced. And 100 years after that, it will need to be replaced again and again, for millennia.
Exactly. I want you, the listener, to truly imagine the world thousands of years from now, long after the Soviet Union is merely a forgotten footnote in ancient crumbling history books, long after our current modern civilizations, our shifting national borders, and even our spoken languages have evolved into entirely new forms or turned to dust and been forgotten.
Deep in the future, generations of humanity will eventually wander back into that forested zone.
They will uncover this massive, decaying steel tomb, sitting completely alone in a vast, overgrown forest. Without our modern historical context, without knowing anything about splitting atoms or RBMK reactors or the Cold War or the sacrifice of Valeri Legasov, they will encounter a place that simply radiates invisible death.
What terrifying new myths, what dark, vengeful gods, or what unspeakable demons will they invent to explain the invisible, deadly force